So, I'll just give it. Oh, so I'll just give it a brief biography, but just to explain more about some of my credentials and why I'm here to opine with you all today. Again, my name is Polyphanes. I'm a blogger for the Digital Ambler. I am a hermeticist, both in terms of a magician and a mystic. I am also engaged in a variety of religious traditions, including Santeria, where I'm also an initiated priest. I've always had an interest in magic and the occult and the esoteric since childhood, but it wasn't until 2011, shortly after I graduated college, that I finally, got out of the armchair per se and started getting myself actively involved in researching and applying this stuff for my own benefit as well as for the benefit of the world around me. And since then, my research has taken me various places. I do a lot of research in Greco-Egyptian spiritual traditions, including the forms of magic and spiritual practices that were done back then, both by the priesthoods as well as by the everyday common folk. I study a variety of divination systems and how they've been practiced throughout the centuries. I'm also specifically here to talk about Hermetic spirituality, philosophy, and cosmology. That's one of the big uh, pushes for my own research, as well as a big focus of my own personal practice. So, for people here, I'm sure some of us, if not most of us, have heard the term Hermeticism before, or heard about things being discussed as Hermetic. Just call things out. When you hear the word Hermeticism or you hear the word Hermetic, what comes to mind? If you're online, just feel free to type stuff in the chat. If you're, in the actual convention, just call things out. Maybe some I can pick up on the microphone. Nothing? No one?
Sorry, Sam, we had it muted on our side, so you couldn't hear people talking.
Ah, well, there we go then.
Someone who sees inward.
Things that are isolated, secluded, secret. Yeah. Yeah,
Sam,
so
could you hear that?
I could not actually know, sorry.
Okay. Guys, if you're gonna comment, please go ahead and come up to the microphone. We have
Or
one
it can just be
comment.
relay.
We have one comment.
Or they can just be relayed by someone close to the microphone. That's fine too.
Uh, a hermeticist is someone who takes and seeks inward through their experiences and their life's journey and uses that to determine the principles of the world around them to better understand how to affect or work with energy and or people and or their circumstances.
Very nuanced definition. I like that. I appreciate that people take like a very high level approach to this. I do like that. Because when a lot of people hear the term hermetic or hermeticism, they think of all sorts of stuff. They think everything ranging from astrology to alchemy to Kabbalah to Golden Dawn stuff. I believe there's a presentation later today that will talk about the Golden Dawn as being hermetic, to Solomonic magic and the conjuration of demons or angels, to more modern things like vibrations or hermetic principles, or to our own shame, the Kabbalion and other things as well. And there's reasons for all this. Even the very high-minded, nuanced explanations that were just given, in the chat and from the converse just now, there's reasons for why this word hermetic has been used in such wide-ranging ways. There are historical causes for it. Maybe not reasons for it, but there are historical causes for it. And what we can kind of rely on that ties all this stuff together under this big hint definition and understanding of the word Hermeticism is a mythic connection to this founder of Hermes Trismegistus. I'm sure most of us has also heard of this guy named Hermes Trismegistus, often seen in medieval works, wearing these very voluminous robes and a very exotic tall hat. I will write his name as Hermes Trismegistos in a kind of Greek way, but you might see it spelled in a more Latin way, or even translated into Latin as Mercurius Ter Maximus. It's the same name either which way. So you might see him in wood blocks and something like this. You might see him presented in a more classical way as the Egyptian god Thoth or the Greek Hermes. And in very modern ways, you might see him presented as a sort of white guy wearing Egyptian cosplay like he came out of a Dungeons and Dragons monster manual. Lots of presentations, lots of ways to describe this guy. But who is Hermes Trismegistus? Why does he matter if it has given us this giant field of what is Hermeticism? So Hermes Trismegistus is a syncretism of the Egyptian Thoth and Greek Hermes. In ancient Egypt, when began to be colonized by the Greeks, both through diplomacy as well as outright war and subjugation, as well as just through cultural exchange of the broader Mediterranean, you had this idea of certain gods in one culture being translations for another. So you might say that Aphrodite for the Greeks was the translation of Hathor for the Egyptians, and so forth. So we could see the Egyptian Thoth and Greek Hermes as being translations for one another, where they are both gods involving language and communication and recording information and the intellect. So it'd be similar to see them as kind of filling similar roles in their respective cultures. But also, not only that, these gods were sometimes smushed together into a new entity that was neither completely Greek nor completely Egyptian, but Greco-Egyptian, something that evolved from the cultural confluence of these various streams. In more Abrahamic contexts, Hermes Trismegistus was also associated with the biblical Enoch, because Enoch, from the books of Enoch and other folk tales, was often associated with the discovery of a variety of sciences and astrology and astronomy and construction and so forth. In some cases, Hermes Trismegistus was associated with being Moses himself or an Egyptian teacher of Moses, because we shouldn't forget that even though Moses was like the patriarch of Judaism, bar none, his name itself is not Jewish. His name, Moses, is an Egyptian name, and he was taught by the Egyptians. He was raised in an Egyptian context. So mythically, Hermes Trismegistus could sometimes be seen as a teacher of Moses. And in the Quran, in Islam, he's also associated with the very vague patriarch Idris as a Quranic identification of Enoch. So we have this very ancient classical pedigree for who Hermes Trismegistus is, and a sort of idea of what he does based on these associations we find in classical mythology from various religions. As for the epithet Trismegistus, this is a Greek word meaning thrice greatest, hence Latin ter maximus. Now, the origin of this phrase is actually a direct word for word translation from the Egyptian language. We see in letters written by Egyptian priests of Thoth being described as, the double great or the triple great, where literally they just repeated the word great, great, great to make a very poetic way of saying greatest. And so this was translated directly into Greek as being thrice greatest. And that's where we get this epithet Trismegistus from. But it was later reinterpreted more poetically or more symbolically to refer to various threefold categories over time when this, kind of word for word translation was forgotten. In some texts, you might see Hermes Trismegistus being referring to different avatars of a divine entity incarnating into human form. You might see different generations of being multiple Hermeses, where you have a Babylonian Hermes or a Persian Hermes and an Egyptian Hermes, each of whom brought new things to the world. Some people interpret Trismegistus as referring to his primacy in the three divine arts, astrology, alchemy, and magic, that collectively combine to form a theurgic way of living. And other people think of Trismegistus referring to his station in the world as being the world's foremost priest and king and philosopher. All sorts of different explanations abound for who Hermes Trismegistus was, what he became, especially in a variety of other myths and stories that arose well after the classical period. When we have the Islamic Golden Age, when we have the Renaissance period, the medieval period, we see Hermes popping up in a variety of different guises and contexts, providing all sorts of wisdom throughout all sorts of literature. So that's how we have all these myths associated with him. But we do have an actual origination Hermetic myth, as in what is Hermes Trismegistus for the beating heart of Hermeticism itself. And for that, we turn to the actual Hermetic origin myth that we find in Book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum. Maybe some of you have heard of this text, maybe not, but the Corpus Hermeticum is a collection of tractates and treatises written in the classical period that are very well known today and contain a lot of good philosophical, mystical ideas of spirituality. And in the very first book of it, sometimes translated the Divine Pymander, we see the origin of Hermes Trismegistus being a divine teacher. In that text, Hermes Trismegistus is in a sort of trance. He's, in a deep state of awareness. And in that state, he receives a visitation from a divine entity named Poimandres, sometimes called Pymander. And Poimandres, introduces himself as the mind of God, a very interesting way to describe it. Sometimes, the mind of sovereignty, and asks Hermes what he wants to know. And Hermes replies, I want to know all there is, to know about the origin of humanity and to know God. And so Poimandres gives this whole revelation, a new way of understanding divinity, the origin of the origin of the cosmos, not just as something that just arose on its own, but as the work of creation of the Godhead, a God beyond the gods, as it were. And once we have the origin of the cosmos, Poimandres then talks about the origin of humanity, our divine origin as children of God, made in the likeness of God, how we came to be in the cosmos as a daring act of love and interest and will to co-create creation itself, just as our divine parent did. And now that we're here, why do we suffer? What's the cause of pain and confusion? Why are we going astray? And what's the solution to all this suffering, to this going astray? How do we find our way up to consciously rejoin with the Godhead? How do we resolve our suffering? Very beautiful story. I encourage everyone to read it if you haven't yet. But at the end of this revelation, Poimandres gives Hermes a charge to go forth and save humanity by teaching them as he himself was just taught. And so Hermes then proceeds to go out and be a street preacher. He actively goes out and makes a call to the way. He says, "You everyone, if you are tired of your mortality, if you are tired of suffering, come forth, come to me, and I will teach you the way to be saved, the manner in which to be saved. I will teach you the way to claim that which is your divine birthright." And the whole rest of the Hermetic text, not just the Corpus Hermeticum, but all the other texts we have surviving from the era, talk and explain about how to do just this by cultivating virtue, by cultivating our divine awareness of reality, coupled sometimes with just contemplation or study of the things around us, but also through ritual works, through initiatic processes, through spiritual elevation of the soul and the purification of the soul within the body. Hermes doesn't just do this on his own as if some sort of dry manual, but he does this in a series of dialogues and letters with his students, specifically the most three famous of them all, Tat, Asclepius, and Ammon. And those of you who are familiar with Egyptian or Greek mythology will recognize some of these names as well, as also being deities that had syncretisms in Hellenistic Egypt. So, what are some of the things that Hermes has taught throughout the Hermetic texts? At a very high level, and this is very high level, kind of laying out the very foundation of it all, we can describe the worldview of the Hermetic text as being monist, polytheistic, and panentheistic. What do these words mean? Monist means that there is one ultimate origin of everything, and that is the Godhead. You might call it God or the Godhead. I prefer the Godhead for more philosophical inclinations here. Everything has an origin in God, everything has a return to God. Everything is ultimately of the same divine substance, as it were, which is God itself. The Godhead is transcendent, beyond, and immanent in all things. So God is not just something distant from us, something that exists beyond the cosmos, but God is closer to you than your own jugular, to borrow a bit of Quranic poetry. God is in you and you are in God. But it's that disconnect of if God is here, why do we feel so distant? It's that tension that Hermeticism attempts to resolve. Hermeticism, in its own context, is polytheistic. It was written by Egyptian priests for an Egyptian audience, where they worship many gods. But the sort of fundamental insight here is that you have all these deities with whom we are family. So we are spiritual kin to the gods in the Hermetic texts. Again, we all have the same source. We all have the same parent of the Godhead. But God exists beyond the gods. God is as beyond the gods as the gods are beyond us. And so we build on a sort of devotion to the gods of the world around us to reach up even higher to the very foundation, to the profundity of creation, of the Creator itself. Now, granted, polytheism wasn't exactly a popular concept after 400 CE for various political reasons starting the Roman Empire. And so these ideas and worldviews were later adapted by Christian and Islamic contexts to be not just monist and polytheist, but rather monotheist. Did they do so successfully? Sometimes better than others. Some patristic writers were very approving of Hermetic texts in this sense, seeing Hermes Trismegistus as a sort of pagan antecedent, a pagan prophet that, heralded the arrival of Christ. Others kind of like, we like this idea, but we don't like the rest of it. We'll just see the parallels and let him be his own little thing. But a lot of texts in the intervening centuries have reinterpreted this polytheism as being a qualified monotheism, where instead of being various gods, you have angels or other divine entities that serve a singular god. In many ways, it's just two sides of the same coin. It just depends on which sort of context you're operating from, whether it's original classical context or later, medieval or post-medieval context. Anyway, within that worldview of being monist, polytheistic, and pantheistic, where we are in God and God is in us, we still experience suffering. We still experience a sense of loss, a sense of alienation. And Hermeticism provides an answer for that, where it provides a goal of salvation, which can be thought of as release from suffering through union with divinity. And so it's by achieving union with the divine, conscious union with the divine, where we can fully engage with divinity as divinity. Therein lies our salvation. The means of this is gnosis, direct, non-discursive experience of divine truth. Gnosis is a Greek word meaning knowledge, but it's not just the knowledge you get from books. It's not just the knowledge you come up with when thinking about a math problem. It's not the knowledge you get from believing in something. It is the experience of truth itself. I could tell you every day about what it's like to dive in the Atlantic Ocean. But if you've ever done that before, you don't have that knowledge of what it's like. I could tell you, but you don't have the experience of it. Gnosis, in this case, is the experience of truth itself, the experience of God itself in its fullness. And in many ways, we can consider Hermeticism, therefore, to be a Gnostic tradition, not unlike what we saw in the Nag Hammadi Hermetic texts. So, if Gnosis is the means for salvation, by coming to know God as God, how do we achieve Gnosis? The Hermetic texts prescribe a means of virtue, cultivating reverential awe and understanding of the cosmos. If you've ever gone out to stargaze in a place far away from any city, and you look up at midnight on a moonless night, and you just see the Milky Way, the immensity and enormity of the whole of the night sky with all of its innumerable stars bearing down on you, where you become absorbed in it. That sort of heartbreaking open awe, that's the kind of mood that the Hermetic texts encourage us to develop in everything we do, not just in stargazing, not just in prayer, but even in the mundane acts of cooking and farming and going to the bathroom and taking a dump, even. You know, everything you do in this world is a gift and an act of divinity, and we should experience it as such. But it's hard. How can you find God in the toilet after all? There's ways of doing that through cultivating this sort of awe, this sort of divine awareness, which we do not just through reason, learning our faith, although those are important aspects of the Hermetic path as well, but through cultivating awe of creation, the Creator. And we do this through the works of prayer and contemplation of reality, prayer to and offering thanks to the Creator of all things, aided sometimes by ritual works to elevate the soul and purify ourselves in it. So this is a very high level approach to Hermetic teachings. And again, I'm covering a lot of stuff here. I'm aligning a lot of stuff here. There's a reason why there's so many texts out there. But in a word, we can sum up this whole body of Hermeticism as the Greek word synagiasmos, which is a very complicated word to translate. It only ever appears in Book 1 Corpus Hermeticum. It doesn't appear in any other text we have extant the classical period. And so translators sometimes struggle with this word and how to translate it. But I like thinking of it as being holy as God is holy, being holy with God. And this can be understood as theurgy. Of course, that raises the question, what is theurgy? Theurgy is another Greek word that can be translated as work of divinity, divine works, work towards divinity. Some texts, some philosophers, some mystics of the classical period use this term to refer to the practice of making gods appear, like through a conjuration, as it were, or by making their presence manifest in idols, as if to make an ensouled statue, so you can make offerings to the god directly through a body. But other philosophers and other mystics use this word more generally to refer to ritual ways of life towards becoming divine or attaining unity with the divine, and so forth. And Senegiasmos in Hermeticism kind of falls along the latter lines of theurgy, of living a holy way of life where everything we do is sanctified for the purposes of sanctifying ourselves and the world around us. And when we look at the Hermetic text as a whole, the way is surprisingly simple to remember our divine origin and what we truly are. That we are not the flesh that we are. Our bodies are things we have. What we are divine souls with an origin in God that do not arise merely from matter, but we are here to enjoy and participate in matter. We are here to revere divinity as much as our own divine nature and origin, to see the world around us as divine because it too has a divine origin, just as we do, perhaps by a different approach, by a different route and manifestation, but it's still divine nonetheless. We are here as an act of love, seeing the cosmos as beautiful in everything, come what may, and to co create the cosmos. God is the creator, but we are God's children, and we want to engage in the work of creation as well. And so we are here to co create the cosmos as is right and proper for us, to develop and perfect the cosmos as we develop and perfect ourselves. And through all this, when the time is right for us, to leave the cosmos and rejoin God as God. Just as if you were in college, you go to college to study and learn, but you go to college to not just get a degree, you go to college to become a better person. The same can be said for masonry, from my understanding as well. You do this to become a better person, and then you go to the world and make the world a better place as a better person. From the Hermetic text Asclepius, this is summarized in one very beautiful line from sections 13 and 14, that the whole purpose, the whole point of the way of Hermes, everything he taught was that we should adore and offer praise to the art and mind of God, not simply to do science for science sake, to do art for art's sake, just to do things because they're cool, but because they could all make the world a better place. And so doing, we instead of trying to pursue various acts and works just because of our own little piddling needs, but to use them to better help us worship God with a simple mind and soul, to revere the deeds of God, and to give thanks to the will of God, which alone is filled to the brim with goodness. There is no malice in creation, even though it might seem that way. It's on us to find the goodness and to make the good manifest, and that is itself a holy work. And so we do all this through spiritual progression. You know, we have to go through a process of refinement. We have to develop ourselves. We have to purify ourselves, mentally and intellectually and emotionally and physically as well. We have to develop ourselves properly to better engage with the cosmos and this divine work. And so we have a way, we have this course, this curriculum, as it were, of developing ourselves and elevating ourselves. And throughout the Hermetic texts, we see this using astrological concepts and frameworks. And this is summarized as the way up, the anados, as it were, the salvific path of release from cosmic vice and suffering into divine virtue and divinity itself. Awkwardly, however, the Hermetic texts don't always give the same one way up. Some models posit a way that this happens only after death, when we release ourselves to the body. Some posit a way that this occurs during life itself. And to show this off, I'll give an explanation of the three ways up we find in the strange, spooky texts of the Hermetic Corpora. So we have three columns here. Book 1, the Corpus Hermeticum on the left, Book 13 in the middle, and the Discourse on the 8th, the ninth, or the Ogdoad and Ennead from the Nag Hammadi codices. In Book 1, we have this model that salvation properly only occurs at the time of death, when we've gone through our life, we developed ourselves, we trained ourselves, and at death, we finally can release ourselves from incarnation and ascend to rejoin God. The model here is that we have a sevenfold nested model of the cosmos. You have the Earth at the center, surrounded by layers of the planets, the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, and so forth. And as we descend from God into the world, we gain an energy from each of these planetary spheres. We gain an ability to work with the world around us because the world around us is itself composed of these other planetary energies, being at the center of them all. So, in order to engage the world, we have to have the tools that equip us to do so. And so in life, it's on us to gain gnosis of divinity. And at death, we give up our character, our persona, as it were, our temperament, the things that make us are the mask we put on, the facade we put on in the world. We leave that behind, and then as we rise up through the planetary spheres, we return to them the energies that they gave us. We return to them the means by which we interact with the world, but also the costs of doing so. Mercury gives us intellect, it gives us cunning. It also gives us a tendency to want to deceive and cheat others. The sun gives us a sense of worth, a sense of well being, but it also gives a tendency towards being arrogant and haughty. Mars gives a sense of justice and drive, but can also give us a tendency towards audacity and rashness and violence. These tools have a cost associated with them. They're not evil in some grand cosmic way, but they do have a cost associated with them. And so we have to learn to give these things up so that we are no longer burdened by them when we no longer need them. And as we rise to the spheres, we then exit into the realm of the fixed stars and thence unto God itself. That's the model we see in Book of the Corpus Hermeticum. In the Discourse 8th and ninth, over here on the right, however, we have a slightly different model. It's similar to what we see in Book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum, but here we have this idea that salvation is possible during life. Rather than waiting for death to ascend the cosmos, we can do so ritually through works of spiritual elevation, by purging ourselves and following the ways of understanding these planetary energies inherent within us to better understand how they operate and then better set them aside consciously through gnosis. And so we can ritually ascend the seven spheres, the planets, in life, and thereby attain a state of divinity in life. And that way, when we truly die at the end of our natural lifespan, then the way up is assured. We've already given these things up, and so we kind of no longer need to engage them. To use a Buddhist metaphor, it's like when Buddha, after enlightenment, still maintained in the world, still engaged the world, but no longer generated karma that would keep him trapped in it. Same kind of idea. In Book 13 of the Corpus Medicum, we have a different approach to salvation, where again, salvation is possible during life, like in Discourse 8th and ninth, but it uses as a diacal model, not a planetary model. So instead of there being a sevenfold model of planetary energies, we are instead composed of a 12-fold model of zodiacal energies, which are called tormentors, even in Book 13 Corpus Medicum, where these tormentors almost like in a very like negative Gnostic sense, trap us in the world. And so by performing sort of Hylic exorcism, we can purge ourselves these tormentors to be remade, to be reborn in a set of divine virtues that come from beyond the cosmos. Book 13 is kind of ambiguous of whether this is a purely ritual process or not, so that's kind of an open question. But we see through these various models of salvation that salvation is a thing that we have to engage the world around us, but we need to do so in a way through gnosis, through knowing what is right and proper for us in order to properly engage them in a way that doesn't drag us down or entrap us in the snares of the world. The world is beautiful. The world deserves to be engaged with. We came down here to engage and build and co-create with the cosmos itself. But it's easy to get sidelined. It's easy to forget all that. It's easy to get caught up in the details and the minutiae of day-to-day living. And that's where we fall astray. We have to keep our minds on the divine origin of where we all come from. So we always keep ourselves oriented towards this way up, however we might consider it. And I keep mentioning, ritual works. I keep mentioning, some things to be done through ritual beyond just prayer and contemplation, which raise the question, what is this sort of ritual? What is this a body of hermetic ritual practices? What is the hermetic art? What is this way that Hermeticism is profoundly known to do to get us to this goal of gnosis and salvation? Now, over the ages, when we have the phrase the Hermetic art, it's kind of ambiguous. Lots of esoteric arts have been called Hermetic for one reason or another, kind of like how I mentioned or point out to at the beginning of the presentation. But when we look at the classical Hermetic texts, they don't really talk about any particular one art. They don't really describe like any specific methodology, any specific set of practices to do this. Arguably anything can be a Hermetic art if it's done with a Hermetic goal of coming to know God better. Mathematics could be a Hermetic art. Geometry, cooking, construction, agriculture, animal husbandry, not just the more fancy things like astrology or divination or priesthood. You know, anything can be made a Hermetic art if you're doing it with the Hermetic virtue of coming to know God in mind. Commonly, however, throughout the centuries, the Hermetic art has been used to refer primarily towards alchemy, the science of change. But when we look at the Hermetic texts, alchemy is nowhere to be found. We don't see alchemy in the Hermetic texts. Alchemy arose in history as a sort of spiritualization of Egyptian temple crafts and temple guilds of metallurgy and dye making, primarily for the creation of sacred idols and sacred images. One might draw a parallel to Freemasonry, where you have actual masonry of building things with stone and wood, and you take that as a model for spiritual development. A similar idea happened in the Greco-Egyptian period with Egyptian temple crafts, transforming them from merely works of art into works of spirituality. So alchemy was roughly contemporaneous and co-located with the development of Hermetic texts. They do arise at similar times, but it's technically a separate spiritual discipline from what we see in the Hermetic texts. They eventually got combined, and then in later times, alchemy really took over as being really important for Hermeticism. But it's technically a separate thing. Alchemy is not itself inherently Hermetic. You can make it Hermetic. You could read the Hermetic text in alchemical light, but the Hermetic texts themselves are not alchemical. Rather, what we see as the Hermetic art in the Hermetic texts themselves is astrology. I just mentioned those ways up. We have a planetary model, we have a zodiacal model. We see astrological references replete throughout the Hermetic texts abundantly. Now, granted, astrology was huge in the classical period, and even today, astrology is huge. So it's not like Hermeticism has a monopoly on, uh, Hermeticism or astrology, vice versa. But we do have lots of mythic connections even in the classical period between astrology and Hermes Trismegistus, where Hermes Trismegistus, whether as Greek Hermes or Egyptian Thoth, was a founding deity of astrology. And just how alchemy may have arisen as a spiritualization of Egyptian metallurgy and dye making, a good argument could be made for Hermeticism to have the same thing from astrology, where you have this technical discipline of astrology through forecasting and making prophecies and making predictions, and taking that as a sort of model for doing mysticism, spiritualizing a technical discipline into a spiritual mystic one. I actually like this theory a lot. And so it uses this sort of geocentric nested model of the cosmos with the Earth, the center, and the planets around us, the zodiacal signs beyond us, the decans above that, the fixed stars, with God at the outermost infinity of the cosmos as sort of ready roadmap for this way up. Now, I keep talking about Hermetic texts. I think it's time to actually talk about them more properly. Everything I'm talking about has been found in the classical Hermetic texts. But what are these texts and how do we have them today? So the Hermetic texts, there's myths and stories about them, like the 42 books of Thoth that are paraded through the streets of Egypt on festival days, and how these are ancient works from ancient Egypt that are transmitted by word before being engraved in hieroglyphs. That's all well and good. But when it comes to the historical aspect of where and how Hermeticism developed, Hermeticism should be remembered as being a Greco-Egyptian phenomenon. It combined Hellenistic philosophy as a framework for structuring Egyptian religiosity. It is fundamentally Egyptian in nature, structured and patterned using Hellenistic philosophy. When I talk about Egyptian religiosity, Egyptian religious practices, there are possible relations to what we see in the Hermetic texts with what we know from the Thoth cults or Amun cults throughout Egypt, possibly some pharaonic worship cults, like when a pharaoh died, he was divinized and given worship and cult as well, like Amenemhat III, particularly for historical reasons. So there's some possible connections we can draw between that. We definitely see influences abounding from Platonism, specifically Middle Platonism, not Neoplatonism, but Middle Platonism, but also Stoicism. We see lots of Greek philosophy in the Hermetic texts. So Hermeticism is certainly syncretic, but it's not eclectic. The distinction here is that there's a method to this where you have these things forming to meld together to something truly new at the time, rather than just picking pieces to kind of smush them together into something someone does. And a lot of texts, a lot of scholars still are beholden to this idea that Hermeticism is somehow Alexandrian, being the primary Greek colony in Egypt. But Alexandria was fundamentally Greek. It didn't have a lot of Egyptianity in it. What we see rather is a lot more influence from further upstream the Nile in Upper Egypt, close to Hermopolis or Thebes, where we also find other great caches of Greco-Egyptian spirituality, like the Greek magical papyri, where we do see crossover between the Hermetic texts and those magical texts. The time period we're looking at for these texts being written is from roughly 100 to 400 CE. It's hard to be more specific than this. Some scholars say that we can say that this text was written in the second century, this one written in the third, but there's no evidence to show that they're much older than this period, and that they were ever composed in a language except for Greek. A lot is made of them having an Egyptian origin, but we have no evidence whatsoever to show that they were written in any other language but Greek. They are Greek texts because Greek was the language of philosophy and mysticism for the common person back then. It is possible there are some antecedents in Egyptian wisdom literature, like the instructions subtext, the Sbite texts, where we do see some similarities, but they could be more aesthetic. They might be too vague to pin stuff on, but some scholars do posit that there is a possible connection to draw from earlier kinds of Egyptian wisdom literature that formed a basis for Hermetic stuff. As for who wrote the Hermetic texts, all evidence currently points that they were written in a Egyptian temple context, written by Egyptian priests or by those taught by them in a temple-centric context. The texts do show familiarity with Egyptian priestly practices, not just of fasting or purity, but also of some technical senses of what a temple was set up like, what sort of practice you could find in them. And when we look at how these texts were developed and the sort of context that they were used in, it shows sort of extracurricular form of mysticism. The idea would be that you would, as a layperson, go to the temple, offer your sacrifices, make your prayers, participate in the local, festivals and whatnot. And then after hours, you would meet up with the cool priest in your local temple, to do some extra stuff. If you wanted something more than just praying for a good harvest or praying for a child or praying for your health or success in business, if you wanted something more, you can go to your local priest to do more interesting things that are more meditative, more contemplative. And so you might have these more mystically minded priests who would take things to a deeper level after hours, as it were. Sometimes these would be done in a temple setting themselves, or they'd be done by interested practitioners and students in a more home-based setting. But whatever we do see that all these authors, and it's not just one author, it's multiple authors, given the time span we see these texts being written in, that operated in a more or less shared milieu of belief and practice. I won't say movement. I don't think the Hermetic, that what we see in the text suggests a concrete school, as it were, a concrete movement, but definitely a shared milieu of practice and belief. And when we come to the Hermetic texts themselves, hopefully this presentation will inspire you to read them, to, try your hand at reading them. And as you do, here's some pointers for you. One, the texts are not in full agreement with each other. I mean, the Bible's not in full agreement with each other, and the Bible's a much more well-maintained work than this. So just bear in mind that you will see differences between the Hermetic texts. But when you do, bear in mind that those differences are really more about details and opinions. All the high level stuff, the texts are pretty much in agreement on. Worldview, purpose, mystic direction, the nature of God or divinity in general. The texts are pretty much in unanimous agreement with this stuff. And when we see differences that are more about differences in opinions between individual priests. Think of it like going to a college department where of all these professors who are in the same field, they all say the same thing, and they all are in agreement with the basics of the field, but they all have their own specialties and their own understandings of that and how that impacts the field as a whole. So if you have a panel discussion of all those professors, you know, they might butt heads, they might have disagreements because this one professor might have this one insight based on their own research, this other professor might have another insight, and those insights might conflict at some level, but they're still in agreement about what it all means in the end. The texts take on a form of dialogues, letters, or sometimes one-sided discourses, which are all very common styles of writing at this point in time with this sort of text. They are sometimes hard for us to read in our day and age because the language and the style, it takes a bit of getting used to. But something to bear in mind is that these texts are not encrypted or encoded. It's a very popular myth to maintain that these texts, you need to decode them and whatnot. No, these texts are as clear as they can be. They're not even that metaphorical. And when they do use metaphor, they're always very quick to unpack the metaphor and explain it. However, what they are is dense. They are very dense in trying to describe stuff that's ineffable, that strains the boundaries of language itself. So the best thing you can do with the Hermetic text is to take your time. Go slowly and read what you can. Don't treat them as fast food where you wolf them down in a single sitting, but treat them like fine dining where you sit down in a good mindset. You savor each bite, you smell each thing, you inspect it, you talk with your companions at the table about it, and you go through each bite thoughtfully and mindfully, moving on to the next dish in order as it forms a whole experience. That's the approach we shall be taking the Hermetic texts slowly and mindfully. And as the texts themselves, here on the right, I have the main classical texts as we currently have them. I mentioned the Corpus Hermeticum. There's also the Asclepius, aka the Perfect Sermon, which was the one most well known in Western Europe during the medieval Renaissance period because it was the only one to have survived in Latin. Everything else was written in Greek or sometimes in Coptic, as we find with the Discourse 8th and 9th, which is part of the Nag Hammadi texts. We have the variety of Hermetic extracts coupled by John of Stobie in his anthology, now called the Stobine Hermetic Fragments. More recently discovered just last century are the Armenian definitions of Hermes Asclepius, which is a very fun, interesting set of texts that are sometimes compared more directly with Egyptian instructions texts, and a variety of other fragments surviving from the classical period. If you want to get good translation for yourselves nowadays, Copenhaver's Hermetica is great for the Corpus Hermeticum and Asclepius. Litwa's Hermetica 2 for the Stobine fragments as well as a variety of others. The Way of Hermes, written by Clement Salmon and Jean-Pierre Mahe, covers another translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, but also the definitions. Salmon also has his own translation of the Asclepius. The Nag Hammadi scriptures, edited by Marvin Meyer, is a great collection of the Nag Hammadi texts, including the Hermetic ones we see as well. And a more recent translation put out like the other week is the Latin Hermes in translation put out by Breppels, a great new translation of the Asclepius with other medieval Latin Hermetica as well. These are the ones I recommend most if you're just getting started in studying Hermeticism, but there's plenty of other translations, some which are better than others, some which are much less better than others. So it depends on what you want. But I should also point out that these are the philosophical and theoretical Hermetic texts. There's other Hermetic texts besides these, but these are good for the mysticism of it. What about the magic? We have this distinction in academia of the philosophical text versus the practical text, or theoretical versus technical. A lot of Hermetic texts are often divided up into these different categories. It's kind of a academic sleight of hand, but it's a useful thing to distinguish, where you have the philosophical texts that focus on the mysticism and worldview, which is basically what we've been discussing so far in this presentation, but also the practical texts, which are much more diverse. Not just one genre, but sometimes even multiple genres of texts, encompassing alchemy, astrology, magic, conjuration, various priestcraft kind of works, and so forth. And because they're often considered much spookier, they receive less attention in academia and scholarship, and so they're often less translated, which is putting us all at a disadvantage because there's all this evidence we have that the mystics of the classical period weren't just doing mysticism, they were also doing magic, and vice versa. They were crossing things over all the time because they formed a complete way of engaging ourselves in spiritual works, again, for the co-creating of the world. And so sometimes we need to bear in mind this distinction of philosophical versus practical is really an academic one when we have texts like the Discourse of the Ninth, which really does sit exactly in the middle of mingling practical stuff with magical techniques and intonations of sacred words with mystic stuff showing us frameworks and ways of salvation. As for what some of these practical texts are, pretty much all astrological texts of the period. They're all Hermetic in one another, even just mythically. But we have some very specific ones, like the Sacred Book of Hermes Trismegistus to Asclepius, a very short work that talks about making a variety of magical rings for medical purposes. We have ways of reading thunder for divination, the Brontologion, the Centiloquium, a set of statements uttered by Hermes Trismegistus for studying astrology. Yatra Mathematica, a set of ways of using astrology for curing disease and performing medicine. And we have all sorts of other alchemical writings from Zosimus of Panopolis, Pseudo-Democritus, and so forth. All these sorts of texts that focus on the practical dimensions of doing spirituality are also considered Hermetic, again, because of the classical association attribution to Hermes Trismegistus. Which leads us to an interesting historical issue. How did this continue developing after the classical period? Well, during the Roman Empire, when Christianity came to the fore and ordered the shutdown of all the temples across the land, well, again, the Hermetic texts were written in a temple-centric context. When the temples shut down, that's when we see the theoretical or philosophical texts basically stop being produced. That was sort of the death knell for the mystic aspect of Hermeticism on its own terms. But the practical stuff, the technical stuff, kept being written because a lot of the Christians and later Muslims, rulers and academics and scholars and so forth, found it much easier to adopt those purely technical stuff from a pagan context into a non-pagan one. So they were easily able to adapt astrology and alchemy from a purely pagan polytheistic context to a monotheist one. Sometimes they adopted it wholesale, They didn't need to change much, but sometimes they had to change and tweak things to get to fit with their own spiritual sensibilities or restrictions. But there was always some sort of translation and alteration from the older stuff to the newer stuff. And as they kept being developed, you had these attributions of Hermes Trismegistus being maintained, but reinterpreted, where Hermes was no longer a god in his own right, nor did he receive a visitation from a god, but he was just a wise man who had an insight into the world around us. And so it kind of got degraded, but there's always still something of the mystic aspect of it all. This stuff was still esoteric, but it wasn't outright witchcraft. So that's how we have this development of the term Hermetic to refer to not so much an older form of classical mysticism, but into all sorts of esoteric stuff that was somewhat licit, somewhat mystical. And from that, we have alchemy, we have astrology, getting to Western adaptations of Jewish Kabbalah into Christian or, quote, Hermetic Kabbalah. Sometimes we see Solomonic magic, like the keys of Solomon of Heptameron, being used to gain knowledge of angels and spiritualities for our own development. This sometimes has been associated with Rosicrucian mysticism, leading also to the Golden Dawn or Thelema and so forth. All this stuff was sort of eventually bundled under the term Hermetic for this historical development of the term, departing its original classical mythic context into a later purely technical one. And so nowadays we have this situation where Hermetic is a very big tent term to use for pretty much anything vaguely Western esoteric. But the question I want to leave you all with is, should they? Because when you deprive yourself of a substance, you're left with just a label. And so if you have a term that everyone's using to refer to anything, the term ends up meaning nothing on its own. I see the historical trend for describing all this esoteric stuff as being hermetic, but without a concrete tie to the stuff that gave rise to Hermeticism, I would say that maybe we shouldn't be using those terms to talk about hermetic as a label anymore. Esoteric, mystic, Gnostic, these are all perfectly great terms that go beyond any one tradition, any one context. But I would suggest that maybe we should start thinking about narrowing the term Hermeticism to refer to a specific way of mysticism. It's a controversial idea, but it's a question I'd like you all to consider for the rest of today, as well as going forward whenever you see this word being used in the future. So that's the more recent historically driven big tent term. But what about classical Hermeticism? Where does that leave us with classical Hermeticism today? I mean, we don't have a lineage of teachers. We don't have, a lineage of initiatic, guides from antiquity into our modern days, initiating anyone to the way up. Arguably, if there even was one, it's been long since dead. So we don't have a direct connection to the classical period of what these people were doing, of what sort of mysticism they were doing. There's an argument that some Sufi schools might preserve some chain of transmission, but it's a lot of series of what ifs and circumstantial evidence that maybe doesn't actually follow through in practice. So Hermeticism could be considered a dead tradition. Sucks. But we do have an abundance of classical Hermetic texts with all they teach in very clear language as best they can describe, guiding us to this particular approach to divinity, to gnosis. And as the years go on, more and more keep getting recovered. The Nag Hammadi texts were just recovered last century, as were the Armenian definitions. And like back in the 90s, we have the Oxford fragments and Vienna fragments being recovered as well. So we're constantly getting more texts recovered from the classical period to give us new light on these teachings and more depth to them. More than that, we have a better understanding of Hermeticism than we ever had before. Not just what the Hermetic texts themselves teach, but what it was like in Hellenistic Egypt. We have a better understanding of the lives of priests and the common people. We have a better idea of the philosophical and religious and cultural and political influences that gave rise to the context that produced these Hermetic texts. And we're always getting better at that. We are dispelling bunches of ahistorical misunderstandings of the past to get a better appreciation of what gave rise to these texts and therefore a better means to understand them. And more than that, with the advent of the internet and people like you who are here for this conference, people are more interested in this stuff more than ever before. They're more connected to each other before. So we're not always having to operate in, secrecy or in solitude. And if you lack a teacher, the next best thing is to find a community, people who are interested with you to read these texts, to study them, to discuss them, and to practice them. That's something we should not take for granted in our day and age. So it's on us today, living today in the lives we lead in our world, to pick up what the ancients left behind, to test it, to work it, and to develop it. We have these myths, on a variety of, contexts, both classical and post-classical, of Hermes finding a pillar engraved with ancient knowledge and therefore decoding it and transmitting it to future generations. While that may be a myth for some circumstances, and if I understand correctly, there's a similar myth of Hermes in Masonic belief too, we should consider ourselves to be modern day Hermes in a way, taking these Hermetic texts, understanding them, adapting them, and applying them to our own lives for us today. And so that leads the question, how does one do Hermeticism where we are nowadays? The Hermetic texts actually give us that sort of information. Some of it's at a high level, but they do give us that information. Start with prayer. Prayer is a good tool that everyone should be doing at some point or other. And the Hermetic texts give us prayers. They actually give us actual prayers that were recited by these people back in the day. Very beautiful. And there's one at the end of this I like to introduce to people who are interested. But prayer to the divine, ideally twice a day, and best at sunrise and sunset, the days and parts of transition of the day into night. Great times to do prayer across various traditions. Meditation contemplation, breathing awareness, like the guided meditation at the beginning of this conference. Great thing to do in general, but also to contemplate the texts, their teachings, the heavens, the stars, the planets, yourself, your own virtues and morality. These are things to contemplate to figure out where you came from, where you're going. Studying development of practice, of course, of the texts themselves, but of science, arts, skills, and all that is good in general. It's on us to co-create the cosmos, to perfect the place, to perfect the world, to perfect ourselves through all these things we can do, whether it's calligraphy or painting or raising and rescuing cats or doing works of construction and destruction. These are all things that be done to better understand the world around us and therefore deity, divinity. And of course, we're all familiar with the phrase know thyself, and that applies to Hermeticism too. But in the Hermetic sense, what does it mean to know yourself? It means to know not just who you are and what you are, but where you came from and where you're going. It requires you to know what's around you, to know your place in the cosmos and your relationship to the cosmos and the powers in the cosmos. That means necessarily you have to know the cosmos, where the cosmos came from, how the cosmos has developed, where it's going, how it's continued to develop and change, degrade, and improve. And because the cosmos has an origin in God, to know yourself means to know God. And that means also to know your divine origin in God, your divine purpose from God. And that means knowing yourself and how to better live your life. It is this cycle that reinforces itself of knowing yourself means knowing everything, means knowing God. And that is what know yourself means in a Hermetic context. And that sounds difficult. It is. And yet, nothing could be more natural for us because we are naturally inquisitive, curious creatures who want to do this. That is a part of our divine nature as well. And for those who want to take it further beyond the above, ritual works, making offerings, doing conjurations, doing spooky stuff, to purify yourself, to develop yourself spiritually, to refine yourself on an ethereal, subtle level, so that we can better attain gnosis, better attain divine insight and true, unfiltered experience of reality for our own way up. There's also ways we can do this, whether in a monotheistic Abrahamic sense or in a polytheistic pagan sense, all sorts of ways. But ultimately, again, we are here to do that work of synergismos, sharing in holiness, to be holy with God as God is holy. And so when Hermes went out to start preaching to the world, the way he did so was to call people to leave corruption behind and take a share in immortality. That is the impulse, the impetus for the way of Hermes. to leave corruption behind and take a shared immortality, to take claim to your divine birthright. And to that end, being at the close of my presentation, I think I don't know if I'm over time, hopefully I'm not. I'd like to give a brief prayer from the end of Book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum. After Hermes got this visitation Poimandres, after he started teaching his new way to the world, he retired for the night and settled in this own prayer, which I find to be very beautiful. And so, with the blessing of you all here today, I like to recite this prayer. If you would like to, recite it with me as well. If you want just to listen, feel free to. But this, I think, really lays bare the whole thing of Hermeticism in this one prayer. So, if you want to join me, please feel free to reciting the Triple Trisagion, the prayer of Hermes Trismegistus, from the end of Book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum. Holy is God, the Father of all. Holy is God whose will is done by your own powers. Holy is God who wishes to be known and is known by your own. Holy are you, by whose word all things are joined. Holy are you, in whose image all nature arose. Holy are you, of whom nature has not formed a like figure. Holy are you, stronger than all power. Holy are you, grander than all excellence. Holy are you, mightier than all praise. O you who are unsayable, O you who are unspeakable, O you who are called in silence, accept pure speech offerings from a soul and heart stretched out to you. Grant my request not to fall for the knowledge befits my essence. Accept me and strengthen me, and with this grace I shall enlighten those who are in ignorance of their race, my siblings, your children. Thus do I believe and bear witness. I go forth to life and light. Blessed are you, my Father. I, who am yours, wish to be as holy as you are holy, for you have given to me all authority. Thank you, everyone, for letting me talk about Hermeticism with you all. Thank you all. Again, my thanks to Verity Lodge, the Workshop Master, and for you all for making this event possible for us all today. If you want to follow me online, you can follow my website, thedigitalamblr.com, which is my website for various resources as well as my own ongoing writings. I'm not much on social media nowadays, but I am very active on Blue Sky for those who want, something more fun and personal to see me as a, real human being rather than just someone as a talking head. So thank you all. Hopefully I haven't gone over too long. So if you have any questions, quandaries, comments, concerns, now's the time. Thank you all again, everyone.
All right, am I unmuted? Okay. Sam, thank you for a very educational and interesting presentation. There was a lot in there that I never knew, and I'm sure many of us here benefited greatly from everything you shared. I know personally listening to all this, there is a ton that is relevant to Freemasonry and what we do. There's a lot of tie-ins. I know Timothy Hogan spoke last night about alchemy and Hermeticism, and this really tied in both of those talks a lot for me personally. So anybody has any questions, please come up to the podium. Any questions? No? Going once? All right. Well, Sam, thank you again. And anybody who's interested, please check out the Digital Ambler blog. There is so much, just a variety of things on Hermeticism and just esotericism in general. There's so much on there. So once again, Sam, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
We're a little ahead of schedule, which